Hi there, my name's Adam Fielding, and welcome to another one of my live streams. So this is going to be a slightly different one. I'm not doing a music making session tonight. I'm not going to be covering any of the tunes I've written during my music making sessions. But since my last stream, I have actually released an album. Yay! Which is fantastic. So I thought this would be a really nice opportunity, given that everything's reasonably fresh in my mind, to actually open up some of the project files and talk about how it was put together and all that kind of stuff. So a bit of an explanation. The album itself is called Nocturnal Transmission, and you can listen to it on pretty much all streaming services nowadays. So Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, Amazon, whatever takes your fancy. Or you can go to my Bandcamp page at adamfielding.bandcamp.com and you can download it. It's pay what you want. So if you don't want to give me any money, that's fine. Just download it, check it out. I hope you enjoy it, and tell your friends if you enjoy it. So yeah, or just let me know. Let me know if you liked it. If you thought it sucked, then still tell your friends, because I could use the exposure. So yes, anyway, so what the hell is Nocturnal Transmission? This would be a good place to start. So it's very much a kind of a love letter to sort of early noughties, late 90s kind of ambient dub techno and breaks. And basically around sort of November last year, so about roughly this time last year, I went on a bit of a sort of ambient techno binge. Essentially, I listened to a bunch of stuff by guys like well, it's just quite a mixture, really. So yeah, there was guys like the Seventh Plane and Sasha, which isn't a huge surprise. I pretty much constantly listen to music by Sasha. Big influence, particularly with this material, and Nail and Baraka. Like it was kind of a mix of like drum and bass and ambient techno, and I just listened to this stuff for pretty much a month solid, and it was fantastic. And it very much kind of defined the latter part of 2019 for me. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, I would love to try writing something like this, but I just don't really have the time to do that at the moment. I was working on a whole bunch of other stuff. So fast forward to October this year, and I have this kind of semi-annual tradition where every October I'll basically try and write as much music as humanly possible, not with any particular end goal in mind, just kind of write music for the sake of it. It's a nice creative outlet, and sometimes it's necessary for me as like a bit of a creative palate cleanser. If I'm constantly working on music for other people and kind of working to spec essentially. And it's sometimes nice to just have this chunk of time dedicated to just working on music for the sake of it. So I felt like I had that sort of creative need fulfilled this year with the live stream sessions. So I decided this year I wasn't going to do any kind of October sessions. I thought, I've got that fulfilled. I'm working on other stuff. It's fine, no problem. So imagine my surprise when I started working on some stuff with a sort of ambient dub techno-y kind of feel, and realized, this is pretty fun. I'd love to see where this goes. So fast forward about a month or so, and I had an album's worth of material written, which I had absolutely no intention of releasing. It was a completely self-indulgent project. I just wanted to write as much as possible, and it's something I'd wanted to do. So yeah, so out popped this album, which I called Nocturnal Transmission. And seeing some love for Sasha and Seventh Plane in the chat. Excellent. If you haven't heard any music by Seventh Plane, I believe there's a whole bunch of music on Bandcamp now under the title Chronicles, I think. That's well worth checking out. I think it's been remastered since the original releases, but definitely worth checking out. So I like in particular, Seventh Plane was a huge inspiration for me and sort of putting this album together. So it's a nice kind of mishmash, and there's some sort of early noughties breaks thrown in there as well. So yeah, so weirdly, I feel like my live stream music making sessions kind of fed into me actually creating this album in the first place, because there were a lot of kind of techniques and tricks that I'd essentially kind of been showing off throughout these live stream music making sessions during the year. And it was nice to be able to kind of just lean on them for something that I just really, really wanted to do and didn't have a lot of time to do it. So, yeah. So, one of the neat things about the album is that there is a track at the end, which is a continuous mix, which is like an hour-long continuous mix. The album itself lasts about I think it's about 70 or 75 minutes or so. But the continuous mix is about an hour because lots of intros and outros kind of get smushed together. That's kind of the whole point, really. So the continuous mix was quite interesting because this was actually put together as I was writing the album, basically. It's all chronologically. The first track is the first track that I wrote, and I just kind of kept adding to it, basically. And so it was a bit of an experiment. And initially, I just started off, if my keyboard wakes up, I initially just started off putting the first two tracks together. So the first two tracks are called Silhouette and In Motion. So as you can see, these are just renders of the full tracks. And so I thought it'd be kind of neat just to kind of put them together and see if they mix. So I've never really tried anything like this. So that was a kind of a fun experiment. So as you can see, there's a bit of tempo automation going on here. I did actually, as I was going, have a bit of I'd sort of at the back of my mind was kind of thinking, how the album was going to kind of ebb and flow as I was working on it. So there's sort of, I think it kind of gets a bit quicker until it gets to the first sort of ambient track and then slows down a bit and then gets quicker. So I kind of end up with this kind of nice sort of, it just kind of nice peaks and troughs in terms of sort of the intensity of the album, which I've really enjoyed doing. So I'm kind of automating the tempo as it's shifting from one track to another. There's lots of sort of filter automation, so I'm using a high pass filter here to kind of fade out the end of the first track as the second track comes in, while that high pass filter is that's coming down, so that there's also a bit of reverb, so it kind of starts off nice and smushy and then it comes out. So good question from Monkey++: is analog heat patched into Ascend on these individual tracks, or is it baked in? So it's baked into these tracks. So after I created the first couple of tracks, I decided to stick them through the Electron analog heat, which for those unaware it's like an external distortion saturation box, but it has a really nice overbridge plugin, so you can use it as a plugin. So I ran the first two tracks through that to kind of give it a nice bit of analog saturation, which I thought was really nice. I just kept doing that as I was working on the album, just kind of applying saturation via the analog heat as I was going. And that kind of forms the basis of what's known as the audiophile master, which is a master which has some slightly different EQ and has the dynamics more preserved, there's less limiting going on. That's available to patrons and Bandcamp subscribers if you wanted to check that out. But Hacker has asked, was this all mixed and mastered in Reason? No. So it was all mixed in Reason, but it was actually mastered in Studio One, which I may get to later on. But this entire continuous mix was put together in Reason, and Tony Burner said, so there's no volume phase between tracks. There are, but I've just used kind of standard sort of fades in the actual audio clips themselves. So it's very kind of rough and ready approach. Like I said, I was just kind of experimenting and doing it as I was going, really. But the entire album itself was written and produced, and the continuous mix was put together in Reason. But Studio One came in at the mastering stage, along with, I used the analog heat as well, so there's a bit of external gear in there as well. So yes, I did master in Studio One. But I'm just going to play this kind of first track transition. So this is kind of a little clip from Silhouette and In Motion, so you'll be able to hear what I'm talking about. So here we go. I'm going to go forwards a bit, so I'll go more here. Here we go. So at this point, both tracks are pretty much 50-50. And in comes the second track. So that was kind of the point at which I realized, hey, there might be something to this. So I decided to continue doing that as I was working on the tracks. But that's pretty much as much thought as, like, I was still writing the tracks as individual tracks, not really thinking too much about how they would sort of bleed into each other. There are a couple of instances. There's one track in particular where there is a massive intro. It's these two tracks, Outside In and Test Pilot. Where it basically kind of just, a massive chunk of not Outside In, it's Test Pilot and Canyons, where a massive part of Canyons is just a lead-in at the end of Test Pilot. So I'll actually play that because that's quite an interesting transition. So this is the end of Test Pilot and the start of Canyons, which comes sort of about halfway through the album, I think. So here we go. So there we go. Now it's fully into Canyons, which is the second track here. So it just has this really nice kind of flow to it, which I really, really liked. And also, I must, like I said, it's like this entire project was just pure self-indulgence for me. Like I wrote this album because I wanted to listen to some ambient dub techno kind of stuff in November, and with a kind of hint of breaks. And I just thought I'd write some. So that's essentially kind of how it came about. So like I said, purely self-indulgent. And the project is going to be quite interesting to look at because I had no intention of sharing this stuff with anyone. So I haven't really looked at a lot of the projects since I actually finished the album, except to kind of search for some samples and stuff. So it was really interesting, and kind of doing the continuous mix as I went was super, super satisfying to do. And just kind of, I just found it was really, really interesting. Interestingly, this track here is called Night Drive in this continuous mix, but it's not called Night Drive on the album. That must have just been a working title. I think it's called I can't remember what it's called. Well, it's Morning something. It's oh well, it'll come to me. So that was really neat. But again, I probably wouldn't have done this in Reason if I was doing it after the fact. Reason is not really geared to kind of work in this fashion, but it was nice to kind of, I mean, it's an hour-long project, so it gets a bit unwieldy when you're kind of moving stuff around. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. So you may have noticed as well, there's a maximizer I think everything's fed into a group channel. Well, certain tracks are fed into a group channel, which has a maximizer in there. And sometimes that kind of kicks in during the transitions, because I was finding at certain transitions where there were transients kind of overlapping each other, it would cause the mix to peak. So I stuck a maximizer in there just to kind of smooth those particular bits out, which again was really useful because I could kind of do that as I was working on the continuous mix. So it's not like it was a massive process to do at the end of everything. It was just something I could do as I was going. So that is basically the continuous mix. There's not really a lot to talk about there, but I feel like the best way to actually talk about this album would be to just open up a track. So if anyone has any suggestions they'd like me to check out, by the way, please let me know in the chat. Tony Burner said, I'm confused about the tempo changes. Wouldn't the tempo you want be already baked into the individual song audio? That is correct. So what I've done is, as the tracks, because the tracks don't share the same tempo. So the first track is 115 BPM. The second track is 120 BPM. So what Reason does is, because the tempo is baked into the audio from Reason, when I drop the second track into this particular project, it will be tempo synced to 115 BPM, to the project tempo. So in order for it to sound correct in the context of the mix and play at the actual correct speed, I have to automate the tempo to go from 115 to 120 BPM. So I tried not to have really extreme tempo changes between tracks because that would be really jarring. But kind of 5 BPM you can quite easily get away with. So because Reason is kind of smart and tempo syncs everything as you're going, you have to automate the tempo changes yourself so that it kind of works. So again, it's not really, I don't think it's kind of Reason's forte to have this much kind of massive chunks of audio stuck together to form an hour-long mix. But it was really neat to use it like this, and it's always fun to use things in ways in which they're not supposed to be used. So unsurprisingly as well, I used some reverb during some of these transitions as well, just to kind of smooth them out a bit. So yeah, it was just really neat, and it's like I said, it's something I've wanted to do for a long time, and to finally pull it off was really, really satisfying. So that's kind of a personal achievement for me there. So right, I am going to open up a project file. So if anyone has any suggestions for tracks they'd particularly like me to look at, please let me know in the chat. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick a little selection that I've worked on. Buskin Bills has said, how do you bake the tempo in? It happens anytime you export audio from Reason, it will include the tempo data in the actual audio file. So because I was exporting everything straight out of Reason, all of this stuff had the tempo data in there. So when I imported it into Reason, it was all correct, which was really nice. So I'm actually going to start with the second track, which I've got highlighted here, In Motion, because that's a good one to start with. So just to kind of highlight that, I'm going to go in this folder actually, just to highlight that I had no intention of really doing anything with this or what my plan was for this. All the tracks are just called October something because it was just my October project that I happened to be working on. So I'm just going to open up In Motion and hope my computer doesn't die during the stream. So yes, Tony Burns says, it makes total sense. Don't know about Reason, but some other doors allow stretching to be disabled on individual clips. You can do that in Reason as well. I just thought for the purposes of putting together the continuous mix, it would make sense to leave the tempo on and just kind of automate the tempo changes between it so I could get really nice, easy transitions. It did kind of feel like I was cheating a little bit, but that was nice. Tony Burns says, are we making requests for tracks to break down? Yeah, absolutely. Any tracks from Nocturnal Transmission, I'll open it up. Probably not the ambient interludes because I imagine they'll be a bit boring. but yeah, I've got like a little selection I can look at, but I am open to anything in terms of these tracks. So if you've watched any of my music making sessions, you may notice an air of the familiar about how this has been arranged and how I've just squeezed so much out of one single block. Tony Burns says, test flight, please. That's fantastic. That was going to be the next track I covered. Thank you, Tony. So I just want to talk a bit about how I got the tracks started, basically. So again, if you've watched any of my live streams where I'm making music, then a lot of this will seem very familiar, which that's something I'll talk about in a bit. So I would start pretty much every single track with a single block. And then squeeze as much as possible out of that one block. So you can see there's lots of kind of empty spots here because this is all automation that I added after creating this block. So I haven't actually looked at this in a very long time, except to source a couple of samples, which I'll get that in a second. Buskin Bill says, where did you get the vocals from? So that's a mixture of recordings by myself, not in this track, I don't think. Yeah, there are vocals in this track. That's just from a sample bank I had kicking around. I can't remember what it was, unfortunately. But yeah, so it's just kind of some chopped up vocal samples I put back to back. So I actually spent quite a bit of time at the start of October organizing a bunch of samples, which is kind of where a lot of this stuff came from. So so I started creating a single block, and I'm just going to play this single block for you now so you can kind of get a feel for how this started out. So it's just 16 bars. Here we go. Actually, I'm going to put the drums in there as well. There we go. What's actually really interesting about this to me, because I totally forgot this was the case, is there's actually several stabs in this kind of bottom synth here. That I don't actually use anywhere in the track. I've actually just removed them and just not used them at all because I think it was just a bit too busy. So there's several notes that play in this block that I started out with that I'm not actually using at all in the rest of the track. So that's kind of interesting. So like I said, there's lots and lots of familiar techniques here that you'll recognize from my live stream music making sessions. So if you go to the redrum, this may look very familiar. I've used a variation of my kind of Eve MP5 setup. I'm using a supercharger instead of a pulverizer. And it's very, very similar to what I'd use during my live stream music making sessions. I'm using a beat map to add extra percussion over the top. So if I just run that, so it's just adding a bit of extra percussion. That's all that's doing, actually. I thought that was going to add some extra hats, but no, it does in other tracks. So that's kind of neat. So yeah, I think a lot of that is baked into the actual redrum itself. So yeah, it's always nice to step sequence stuff using the redrum. I just find that very satisfying. It's nice to vary things up. So yeah, so there's that. Monkey has asked, yes. But how many snorts are in this album? We need real data. I hate to break it to you, but there are no snorts in this album. None whatsoever. I was actually about to get to kind of what I used as my main sort of go-to transition technique, which I'll do now. So I've got a DR1, surprise, surprise, hooked up as an aux send, and that's going into a pump, which is then going into a high-pass filter channel EQ. So basically what that means is it's a reverb that's getting kind of a bit of really obvious sidechain pumping going on, and then that's going into this channel EQ, which is just completely trashing the lows, and that is it. Hacker99 says, okay, we'll settle for how many instances of DR1 there are. A lot. I mean, even in the continuous mix, there's several DR1s, which is kind of fun to me. So in this track, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 DR1s. There we go. That was a fun exercise. So yeah. Yes, there's that. So this reverb wash thing that I've got going on. So if I go to the main song, there's this FX1 aux send, which I've got set to the drum channel. So if I just solo that, you'll be able to hear it kick in here. So that's kind of my go-to transitional element throughout the entire album. I've used that a lot. So disappointing. Next album, each track has to have a minimum of 16. Yes, absolutely. More reverb means better. So yeah, so that was kind of my go-to. One thing as well is with this album, I wasn't afraid to reuse techniques. Like I used a lot of techniques, and kind of even certain tracks share sounds. Just I felt like it kind of fed into the sort of more it kind of gave everything a more cohesive sound as well. And because I was putting everything together so quickly, I didn't really have a lot of thought, a lot of time to think too much about kind of whether things worked. I was leaning on things that I knew would work. And I think it works. I think it works in the album. I don't think I've used that trick a lot. I think it pops up kind of pretty much every track. But you know, it works, and it's not obtrusive and in your face enough to be obnoxious, I think. Also, I've something else you'll recognize from my live stream sessions is the use of this chappy, which is the beat former here, which I used all over the place. So something else I did a lot in this album is just take percussion loops and stick them through the beat former just to kind of make them pop a bit more. So if I just play that, so that's literally just a loop that I grabbed from a sample library, stuck it through a beat former and put it through some reverb. So if I turn that off, that's how it sounded originally. So I'm just kind of simplifying it, helping it to pop a bit in the mix. That's really nice. So that brings me quite nicely onto workflow, which is where things get kind of interesting for me. So one of the things that I've really, really loved about working on this as an album or a project in general is that I got into this kind of weird sort of creative sort of flow state, really, which was really interesting. It's something I've sort of experienced to a certain degree with the live stream sessions, which is by separating the compositional element in terms of creating a single block that you use for everything else from the arrangement and production sort of process. It means you don't get fatigued on either, really, which is a really magical place to sit. So it basically means that it's kind of just this perfect balance where it's just creatively challenging enough to be engaging, but also you're not tiring yourself out by doing the same thing over and over again. So that's kind of why I describe it as this creative flow space, because it was so satisfying to kind of be in that space and just be able to kind of continuously work on music. And that's essentially why I wrote it in the first place, is because I was enjoying it so much. It was a very autotelic process. The whole thing was its own reward. So I've mentioned before that this was a completely self-indulgent album, and it absolutely was, because I really enjoyed making it. And that's why I'm so surprised that other people are enjoying it so much as well, is because I didn't think that would be the case. So that's really, really wonderful to know. So yeah, the workflow. So basically speaking, I had this system that I was using to get ideas going. And because I had this system, it basically meant that so long as I had something like a vague idea that I could work with, I knew that I wasn't going to get completely stuck or bogged down in a track. I think I had one or two ideas that didn't quite pan out, but those are quite easy to spot early on. So I kind of quickly put them to one side, and maybe I'll do something with them in the future. But for the most part, I'd say sort of 95% of the ideas I came up with actually ended up being fleshed out into complete tracks. So what I tended to do was I would actually start with a sample and then just kind of chop it up and then add some drums and some bass over the top of that. So these samples, I thought it'd be really neat to show an example of kind of what these samples actually are. So if I go into this folder, so I've actually made a folder that contains all of the samples I used throughout this album, so I can kind of show you how they started and what they turned into. So in motion. So this makes use of 4 different samples. There's samples and loops. So I think I started with this particular sample, which is Stringy Atmos. I can't actually remember where they came from. Buskin Bill says, any Shepherd tone builds in any tracks? I've never actually tried that myself, to be honest. That'd be super interesting to try out. I always find it really, really tense to listen to Shepherd tones. So that would be really nice to play around with. But none on this album. So I think I started with this particular sample, which is Stringy Atmos. So it sounded like this. So that's a 75 BPM, 6-second sample. So I ended up transposing it down 8 semitones, and I think I stretched it. So it's sort of it's stretched to 16 seconds instead of 6, which I could get away with because I was transposing it down so much as well. And I also processed it with some reverb, surprise, surprise, delay, ozone images just to kind of widen it a bit, and some pump to give it sort of some side chaining. So that's sort of side chaining, pumping sound. So taken in isolation, it sounds like this. So yeah, so that original sample that sounded like that, I just kind of tweaked slightly so it suited my needs. And then from that point, it's really interesting looking at this actually, because I think this is actually laid out in the order in which I put the track together, which is super interesting to see now. So I did add an extra texture, which I think comes in the song itself. And that sounds like this. Yes, Tony Berners said, now we know that Adam only uses one rack column when no one is watching. Again, I think that's just because I was putting these tracks together so quickly. I didn't really put a lot of thought into organizing stuff beyond labeling the actual mix channels, and that's pretty much it. It was just one continuous list. Also, I was very careful not to overcomplicate things. You might have noticed in this track, it's not a huge number of tracks. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 mix channels. So that's pretty reasonable. Again, it's very similar to the kind of track count I would have in a live stream track, really. So I am going to sort of talk about that in sort of the similarities between the two a bit more in a bit. So I took those samples and kind of played around with them. So there's this extra texture that pops up later in the track, and I transposed that down a semitone. I think I did the same, kind of stretching out a bit sort of thing, and I think I just used that as a bit of a build. So So originally, again, it sounded like this. So just kind of nice, simple pads. And that's kind of how the track got started, really. So from that point, I decided to add some bass, so it's essentially... Yes, Baskerville said 12 channels and 9 DR1s. That's actually quite an amazing ratio, which I'd never really considered. That's actually incredible. So the question is, what are the 3 channels I didn't put DR1s on? For shame. So I'd start with a sample, chop it up, and then add the drums and the bass. So the bass in this case came from a VK2. Which was sort of spotted in the chat, which adds this really nice kind of, just a light sort of growl on the bass. So I'm just going to play that. So the great thing about working on this 16-bar loop is that that's 30 seconds of music to play around with right there. And you can get a lot out of 30 seconds of audio, as I did. So yes, then I added some drums, which in this instance came from the redrum. So yeah, that was a lot of fun to just mess around using the redrum, adding a bit of shuffle. That's always fun. So yeah, step sequencing. I don't think that pattern really varies throughout the entire track. It just kind of lulls you into this sort of hypnotic sense. So and then from there, So I had a very kind of, I basically had a palette of sounds that I used throughout the entire album, and that consisted essentially of, I was using Drumvolution for the drum hits. Surprise, surprise. And I was using Massive for those kind of chord stabs, which I might dip into in a second. VK2 I used for bass and for some really nice arps in places as well. I used Respire for a few tracks as well. And I also bust out my Access Virus Snow, which I think that popped up on quite a lot of tracks because it was just really, really useful for creating ARPs. So I'm going to play one of those ARPs now, actually. So this is an ARP that I wrote using my Access Virus Snow. And yeah, it just kind of helped to sort of basically glue the rest of the track together as things progress. So I did that quite a lot when I was actually working on the track, working on the album. And so I've had a bit of reverb and delay and stuff like that. But the thing is, with the actual virus sections, I basically wanted to commit to these. So I rendered them to audio, and then I would just ditch the instance of the virus VST that I was using. So unfortunately, all the patches are gone, but they weren't particularly complicated. Like, I knocked them together pretty quickly, to be honest. So this is the ARP that's used in this track. So the virus is wonderful for really squelchy sounds like that, those sort of acidy, distorted synth lines, really, really useful. I used it as kind of a sort of percussive thing in a lot of tracks as well. Tony Byrne has asked, I noticed the drums in the stream tracks are nearly always routed to a single mix channel rather than individual channels per drum. Does that ring true for the post-production mixing? It depends entirely on what I'm working on. I used to kind of have this notion that the more mixed channels you had in a project, the better you were as a mixing engineer. And kind of over the years, I've realized that's nonsense, and keeping things simple is sometimes the best way to go. And in this particular project, I thought it would just make sense to keep everything in one channel. That's also the case during most of my live stream music making sessions. I would say the big exception to that rule is if I'm working with acoustic drums. In that instance, I will use several mixed channels, and so I can actually tweak the sound properly. And every now and then, I'll break. If it depends on if I want to tweak the sound. If I want to tweak the kick or the snare, then I'll break those out into separate channels. But even then, I tend to kind of group everything together into one single channel, because it just keeps things nice and tidy and organized, which is useful when you're bouncing stems further down the road. So it was really interesting, kind of relying on this very kind of, I essentially had a very set palette of sounds that I was working with. And again, there's the VK2 here, which is this kind of nice synth harp. So a lot of the sounds in this album aren't super complicated. Like this VK2, it's a really simple patch. I've used 2 oscillators, and it's stuff that I've kind of played with tons of times before. All of the character comes from the filter, basically, the filter and the spaciness of the reverb and the delay. But it's just kind of, it's nice to just let those simple kind of rich sounds just shine, basically, by not having too much going on. So yeah, again, I've sort of touched on this, but by focusing on just creating a single block while working on the tracks as they were, it meant I could focus on the sort of compositional aspect first and kind of get this sort of satisfying 30 seconds or so of audio down. And then I'd go from there and go to the song, and I'd have a completely blank slate and just be like, okay, so how do I build up to that block, essentially? So I think the first time in this track when everything sort of kicks in, it doesn't happen until sort of around 3 minutes into the track, and even then we're missing the ARP. So a little further, sort of 3 minutes 44, that's when everything kicks in. Even then I'm missing the sort of stringy atmosphere. So yeah, it was really fun to kind of work in that way, in sort of a more long form project. And again, I think a part of the reason why I was happy to do that is because I've been doing it so often during the year, during my live stream music making sessions. So I think Chiroptera was the track that kind of was sort of very much the embodiment of that idea, really, of kind of squeezing 10 minutes of audio out of a block, really. And although this doesn't go quite that extreme, I think there's a couple of tracks that kind of edge towards sort of 8 minutes or so in length, but they tend to kind of be based around one block. There might be 1 or 2 tracks in there that use a couple of blocks, but it's very much about kind of lulling you into this sort of hypnotic frame of mind. So just letting the ideas kind of play out and do their own thing as they work. So as a result of that, like I said, it kind of got me into this really, really satisfying creative flow state where I wasn't exhausted. I wasn't getting burned out on one process or the other. I was just constantly switching between the two. And when I was arranging everything, that's generally when I would start kind of adding in extra sort of production flourishes and mixing everything properly. So yeah, it was just a really, really nice way to work. And if you've not done that yourself, I really highly recommend it. Just focus on making sort of 16 bars of just a block in 16 bars. Play around with that and see how much you can get out of that, because you'll probably surprise yourself how much you can get out of 30 seconds of audio. You just have to sort of dial back that part of your brain that just wants to change things up. Just let the ideas kind of flow and do them as they are. Let them have their own space. So I was going to talk about these some of these like chord stabs. So I used Massive for a lot of these. So I had a whole bank of like these sort of baked in sort of rave chords. So that's going through an absolute ton of reverb. So I kind of feel like because I was using baked in chords in all of these patches, it kind of feeds really nicely into the vibe I was going for, where they would rely on kind of chord stabs as samples in a lot of cases. And it just kind of, it's a really nice way of working because you're not overcomplicating things. Sometimes you end up with sort of ideas that don't harmonically align with what you would typically expect if you were working on the chords manually, for instance. So I found that very interesting to sort of work with. Sometimes I had to tweak the patches a bit so they'd sit with the rest of the track. Buskin Bills has correctly pointed out that's no donk. No, it's not a donkey album. It's very much a sort of lots of reverb, letting it kind of wash over you late night, early morning listen. I was going to say a nice one to listen to with your pals after a night out, but I imagine nobody's having any nights out at the moment. So yeah, let's forget that one, I guess. So yeah, the actual let's have a look at this massive patch. I did actually modify a few of these, so they're all pretty straightforward. It's just, yeah, that's basically it, really. It's just 3 oscillators, all detuned by varying degrees. So in this instance, we've got minus 12 semitones, so it's minus 1 octave, minus 9 semitones, minus 5 semitones. And it's just just using the filter to kind of just give a stab. It's like, I don't really know what to say about that. It's an incredibly straightforward patch that just kind of works. It did, this entire project did give me a new appreciation for Massive, which I haven't used in a while, actually. And it kind of reminds me of when I watched an interview with Disaster Piece, who did the Fez soundtrack for the game Fez. And he used Massive to create some not particularly complex sounds, but the music that he writes using those sounds is just absolutely phenomenal. I love the Fez soundtrack. So it was a really nice example of just, your sounds don't have to be really, really complex to write good music. I think that was kind of a message that got lost kind of around 2010 or so, when everyone was writing preset core that sounded like, the synths was changing presets every 16th note. It's nice to just let ideas stay as they are and kind of let the listener kind of come to them. It's nice. So I'm not going to look too much more at this track. I'm going to open up another one, which is Test Flight, which was mentioned by Tony Byrne. So I'm going to open that up. Hope my stream doesn't fall apart. And I'll close in motion because I'm done with that. So there we go. Right. Here we go. So yeah, Test Flight was this was kind of the second sort of breaksy track of the album, really. I'd say there's like 3 more breaksy tracks in the album. So there's I can't remember what they're called though. Let's have a look at the actual tracks. We've got Drifting Light, I think, is one of them, and Test Flight and Canyons. So Test Flight mixes into Canyons, which is really, really satisfying. And again, it's another single block track, as Tony Burns just pointed out. So again, if you're just joining me for this stream, if you haven't listened to the album, you can grab it. It's Pay What You Want from my Bandcamp page, adamfielding.bandcamp.com. It's called Nocturnal Transmission. And you can also stream it via your streaming platform of choice, whether that's Spotify or Amazon or Apple Music or Tidal, if you're one of the 5 people using Tidal. So Basketball says, I think we make him work harder most weeks. It's really interesting, actually, because I feel like when I was working on the blocks during these sessions, I was getting, I think it's because I knew that I was separating the 2 processes. I got really, really into it. So yeah, it was quite a lengthy series of quite lengthy sessions, really, to put these together. Perhaps I was obsessing over particular details a bit more than I needed to. But again, so this I'll just play a bit of this track so you know what it sounds like. So again, I created a block, and then from that block I created the rest of the track. So this is what that block sounds like. So that's kind of Test Flight in a nutshell, really. So again, it's a pretty modest track count. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tracks in this entire tune. So yeah, so again, it started off in a very similar way with this sort of atmospheric sound. So if I go to my sample folder here, look in Test Flight, And I can't find the damn thing. It's trying to open the song, that's why. Wonderful. If I just go to import audio file, there we go. Oops. If I go export into samples, let's go to test flight. So this is the sample I started with, which kind of essentially made this track come together. So that was just a very simple just a simple synth loop, really. And by sort of just bringing that in and tweaking it a bit, it became this. So again, that just the original sample. So that was kind of nice to play around with. So if we just go into comp edit here, you can see I've properly sliced that up and sort of crossfaded individual bits. So it starts off -5 semitones, then goes to 2, and then it goes down again to -2. So you end up with this kind of, Tony Burns says something really lovely about that chord change to minor. So it's actually really interesting. It just because I was using a sample that was kind of hard locked essentially. Again, it kind of goes back to the whole sampled chord thing. I couldn't alter the notes within the chord. I was just transposing the entire thing up or down, which led to this really odd kind of eerie result, which I really liked. So that was really fun to work on. So yeah, again, I'm not doing anything revolutionary with the samples here. So it was just brought it in, stretched it out, transposed it, and ended up with this sort of little sort of melody kind of thing going on, all from 3 seconds of audio. So from those 3 seconds end up with 30 seconds, which is nice. So again, that's just going through a bit of reverb, a bit of delay, and having a bit of pump applied to it. So again, I've got that sort of reverb wash thing going on again here as well. So at a certain point in the track, it's like a big sort of wash as I'm just feeding the drums through this reverb that kind of just ends up smushing over the entire mix. One thing I do want to talk about is the breakbeat, because that started life sounding like this. And it ended up sounding like this. So I haven't really sliced it up or anything. I have just lobbed that loop in there and kind of stuck a few effects on it. And then I layered it with the redrum, and that kind of just helped to round it out quite nicely. So one of the really interesting things about that is that I ended up sticking it through one beat former. So I'm just going to bypass all these other ones and just play it. So I've actually got this beat former, and I set it like it's really extreme settings. I set squash to -10, so it's like it's really heavily gated, and it's having a bit of boom, bit of punch. So it was already like quite massively sort of transforming that particular sound. And I was like, wouldn't it be really cool if I could just do that again? So I just copied that and literally just pasted it into another instance of beat former with the exact same settings, and then it ended up sounding like. But I was still thinking, like, I really liked what it was doing to the snares in particular. Like, it has this kind of really sort of, it has this sort of rattling kind of effect to it. So I was like, I wonder what would happen if I doubled my beat former count again, just use the exact same settings and all 4 beat formers, and then. I really liked how that turned out. So you ended up with this sort of, on certain snare hits, it just kind of ends up with this sort of kind of sound, like this sort of slightly sort of machine gunny kind of effect. It's like it's almost like the snares kind of breaking apart, and it just helped it to sit really nicely with the rest of the track. So again, here's the original breakbeat. Like, I feel like that's way too busy for the kind of stuff that I was working on for this particular album, but it just has this really nice kind of, as Tony Burns says, it's a nice crunchy kind of sound to it. JLix76 says, could you do that same sample pitch change using grain, or would that be more difficult and not sound the same? You could. I just don't really see the point in this particular instance. I mean, there's nothing stopping you from loading. I mean, I've done this during my streams before, where I've opened up a sample from the Reason Factory sound bank and just used that as like a pad. But in this instance, I just wanted to work with audio. I think that's just kind of the sort of mindset I was in at the time. So that you could, but it would probably sound different as well. But I just liked having it as audio in the track, so I could just kind of slice it up and then sort of say, okay, I want to transpose this bit by this much, or I want to just kind of stretch it around. It just had kind of a more sort of immediate kind of feel to it, which was very important when sort of putting this together. So we bring some of this stuff together. So there's a bit of percussion there, and I used an instance of Respire for the bass. So bringing that in. So again, I'm using a very similar palette. So I was kind of using samples to get things going, using an instance of Massive to add some nice sort of chord stabs in there as well. And again, because the backbone of the track, this sort of atmospheric sample, because it was all locked to the same chord just kind of being transposed up and down, it meant that so long as I was using the same chord in Massive, essentially, I knew it would fit as I was kind of playing the notes up and down the keyboard, which was really nice. So I just had to kind of stick to that, and it would work. So I also brought in some vocal samples and some virus sweeps, which I'm going to try and play. So again, that's, you know, I was using my Access Virus for that and just kind of had a nice simple ARP going, and I just bounced it to audio, and I was like, that's it, that's baked, I'm committing to that. So again, it's one of the things I learned from doing my streams is if you want to get an idea going, it's important to commit to ideas very quickly. And there's a lot of that in these tracks. So as Thor Inside has said, multiple beat formats would be like bouncing the same track multiple times, I guess. Yeah, I guess so. So yeah, it's basically just, it was really funny opening this up again, because I opened this up so I could see what samples I'd actually used in this particular track. And I was like, why are there 4 beat formers stacked together? That's a really weird thing to do. And it's just one of those like sort of moments that I had when I was actually working on this, where I was like, I wonder what would happen if I just stacked more of the same thing on top of itself. And the result was a really nice kind of crunchy breakbeat kind of effect. So it started off as kind of this very smushy kind of sort of very techno-y drum sort of breakbeat to a more sort of crunchy, sort of techy kind of sound. So that's more or less the extent of how this track was put together. So, or this particular block. There is this VK2, which is one of my favorite sounds on the album, which is so not particularly complicated. Again, a very simple sound. It's just I know that VK2 is a really nice synth. So all the distortion is coming from the drive in the synth itself. I'm just letting the filter kind of open and close and just give it this nice juicy overdriven sound. So it's just a bit of reverb and a bit of delay on top of it. I say a lot, and that's pretty much it. It's just as Monkey Plus Plus says, VK2 is so smooth. It is a smooth synth. It's been really lovely rediscovering that this year, actually, because I feel like I feel like I was neglecting it a bit. But yeah, it's a really wonderful synth. I think the Legend is kind of due a similar treatment soon, because I haven't really been using that enough, and I know that's a wonderful synth as well. Jalik has asked, are all the beat formers unified in their settings? Yes, they're all exactly the same. So it was literally just a case of, I wonder what happened if I have this exact same thing twice, and then just copied those two and ended up with 4. So just for the sake of argument, let's see what would happen if I'd continued this thought process. So let's go in there and let's have that come out. I'm just curious now. It's satisfying my own curiosity. So it helps if I unmute that. I think that's a step too far. Yeah, Buskin' said, it sounds like it's removed lots of the reverb from the sample, multi-beat formers. Yes, it absolutely has. I think it's because when you reduce the squash value, it essentially works as a gate expander. It is going to remove a lot of the quieter elements from the loop, which is really useful in kind of letting those transients pop a bit more, which is great. It's exactly what I wanted here. Tony Burns says, haven't seen Poly 6 in a while. It's been a while. It's really funny because I'm actually working on some stuff at the moment with sort of as part of another project. And one of the suggestions was to make it sound more like The Sprawl, which is an album I released very recently through Fixed. So can you make it sound a bit more like The Sprawl? And I was like, well, I used the Poly 6 all over that for all of the ARPs. So I guess if I just bring in a Poly 6 and see where that goes. And yeah, it totally worked. So yeah, I still love the Poly 6. Don't worry about that. Still great. Yeah, I need to bust that out again. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. There's like a few vocal samples and some extra background bleeps. This is another sample that I used, which is... It's a really long sample as well, but I just ended up using a bit of it, and it just sits in the background of the track. So again, if we go to comp edit, there's a lot of kind of slicing and repitching of stuff just to make sure it fits. So it's in this sort of way, it reminded me of working on some of the jungle tunes early this year, where I was taking a chunk of audio and just trying to make it a bit more my own, really, sort of help it to sit with everything else. No need to reinvent the wheel with sort of everything that you're using, but kind of if it sits nicely, it was be really, really, really nice. So if you happen to have a lot of samples sitting around in your hard drive and you're not using them, I can highly recommend sorting through them and finding the stuff that you might want to use yourself and just kind of keeping it in a separate folder, because that was great. I mean, I'd say like I spent quite a lot of time organizing samples before I started this. Like it was, I described it as it was quite a bit like having to do all my chores before I could go out and play with my friends. So it was really, really fun. So yeah, so that's pretty much Test Pilot. If I go to the actual song view, so I don't think there's any extra elements that aren't in the block itself. So it's actually one of the simpler tracks on the album. But it's one of my favorites. Like, I really like how it turned out. It has this kind of weird sort of menacing feel to it. And that feeds quite nicely into the follow-up track Canyons as well. So really, oh, here we go. Here's another sort of drum wash. So I'm going to just play this little section here. So it's just a little kind of wash there. Jay Licker said, by the way, that Reason 1 song you submitted for the One Song Challenge was quite tasty. I didn't submit a song. I don't want to be taking credit for someone else's work. Unless, I don't think I did. I'm really confused now because I want to link to that. But yeah, I don't think I submitted a song. So yeah, so that's Test Pilot. It's a nice, simple tune that kind of does its thing and has a very particular mood, and there we go, it moves on. So I reckon let's have a look at another track. I was actually going to open up Lucidity, but there's one thing I wanted to show off in another tune. In fact, I'm going to open up Drifting Light, which is another sort of breaksy track, because there's something in there in particular that I wanted to highlight as well. So by this point, you'll probably be getting bored of me kind of saying, you know, how I got started with these tunes and all that stuff, because it's exactly the same, I believe. So I started off with a sample, which is this sad Atmos thing here, And if I go into my NT samples folder, I'll just play it and you can hear what that sounds like. So it's... So, yeah, that's sad Atmos. So I'm going to just solo that track and play that. If it plays, there we go. So I actually did naffle with that sample. But in this instance, I feel like that's more of a background element in the track itself anyway. So this is the actual block that I created for this track. So yeah, so it's kind of a sort of breaksy track, and you might hear in the background this sort of vocal thing that has a really, really long delay time, and I'm going to get to that because that's the thing I wanted to talk about. So I started with that and just added, I actually did something different here, it looks like. I added some chord steps over the top, pretty sharpish. So there's lots and lots of delay here, and I think because there aren't that many elements in these tracks, so again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 channels again, it really kind of gave me free rein to just go completely nuts with the reverb and the delay. So I used reverb and delay a hell of a lot, like even more so than normal, and especially in this track. So the thing I wanted to talk about was, actually I'm going to solo this key art because this is another Virus audio clip which I used here. So again, I just rendered this and I was like, this sounds cool, I'm just going to use this. So yeah, that was really nice, and it was really nice to just kind of sort of pull myself away from working on the 16-bar block for a second and just focus on noodling with the Virus Snow, just to kind of create sort of these nice sort of simple arps that I could just stick over the top and bring in later in the track. So it's all about having all these elements ready to go, basically. So the thing I wanted to talk about was the vocals that come in. So I'm just going to play a bit of this block again. Actually, I'm going to go to here, right. So yeah, you may have noticed there's an actual audio track there for the vocals. That's because those were recorded by me. That's me there. So I'm just going to solo that track and play it. So I'm going to bypass all of the effects, and you can hear what that sounded like before it actually gets processed, and it's pretty funny. So there we go, some very, very heavily auto-tuned me just going, and so I was like, that sort of sounds a bit weird. I don't really want to drown it in reverb though, so I did add a little bit of reverb, a lot of reverb, and a really, really long delayed tail on that. So it's like, it's super long delay, And I don't know why I decided to do that, but I repeated that in a few tracks. It was just nice to have the vocals just wash completely over the rest of the mix. So what I did, so just again to kind of compare, that ended up sounding like this. J-Lux says your female voice is quite sexy, Adam. Ooh, it's getting a bit hot in here. Ooh. Right. So this is something I've done during many of my streams, but this is actually I slightly flipped that idea, because normally what I tend to do is if I sing falsetto, I'll whack the formant shift up, so that gives it more of a feminine sound. So if I do that, if I turn it to plus 16, for the sake of argument, it was minus 16 originally. It sounds like this. And it just didn't really do it for me. I thought it was more sort of interesting just to kind of shift it down. So I'm not doing any pitch shifting or anything using the Neptune. That's all baked into the audio. I used if I just go in here, I just used the pitch edit in the sequencer itself. That is a really, really long delay decay. So yeah, again, it's probably a good thing. I think I added the vocals later in the block. Yes, the last thing I added. I've noticed I've automated the feedback of the delay, because I'm pretty sure at the start of the track, yeah, I've set that to 0 so I can stop it from playing, which is very useful. So it was kind of just nothing revolutionary, just kind of some falsetto vocals and then kind of just formant shifting that down instead of up. But I was like, hey, that sounds kind of neat, so I'm gonna go with that. I was actually really surprised with how well that worked. So that was a bit of a change. Instead of just nicking vocal samples from various sample packs and stuff, I thought it was nice to bring in some of my own for a change. There are some more less formant shifted vocals in some of the tracks as well. In fact, one of which I might get to shortly. But this is another good example of the same kind of process I would go to when putting the blocks together. So start with a sample, add some drums, add some bass. I'm assuming that's a VK2 bass. Yep. So if I go to the song where the drums aren't all muted. So over the top of that, I added a breakbeat, which again uses a whole lot of beat former that's brought right down, so it just completely changes the character of the breakbeat. So if I bypass that, it has much more of a kind of rattly sound to it. So by bringing in beat former, it just makes it more, just kind of helps it to pop a bit more, gives it more of a crunchy feel, as opposed to a sort of more sloppy kind of sound, which isn't really what I wanted. So again, very slight change, just automating the modulation on that VK2 so the filter opens up a bit more. So yeah, it's nothing revolutionary, but it's kind of, I just like the idea of taking sounds that sound good on their own, kind of bringing them all together and just letting them kind of do their thing, really. So again, that was brought in the bass and add some more atmospheric bits, and that, again, it's very similar to everything else and very similar to the to my live stream tracks this year. So I think I'm going to open up one more project file from here, and that is the last track on the album, I believe, which is Lucidity, which I've really liked, and it's another one which has some of my vocal stylings on it. This actually looks slightly different from some of my other tunes. So I am actually going to play, here's the block, the 16 bar block that I started with. So this is kind of I would have spent a bit of time just putting this together before arranging everything. So it started off sounding like this. Oh, bless the loon. So that's actually, I'd say, a more subdued block. It was the last track on the album, and I felt like it'd be nice to have something that was a bit more reflective and kind of a bit more mellow as things were kind of winding down, which I thought was really interesting. Busker Bill says, couldn't you use the channel gate expander to do the same as Beatformer? Yes, I did that in my last music making session, I think. So you'll have noticed I've used Beatformer all over the place on this album. And in instances where I've just used it to dial down the squash, which is so I could use it as a gate expander, you could just use the Reason Studios, where is it? Channel Dynamics. Just use the gate expander section here, which is what I did during the last music making session. So yeah, that's perfectly doable. I think there's a little bit more going on under the hood with Beatformer, and also you have access to all the other parameters which do various other things. I'm not entirely sure what they all do. I think Air applies some kind of EQ or something. It just basically, I like it because it's incredibly straightforward. So if I'm working on something like this where I just need to throw something in that I know is going to do what I want it to do, it's incredibly useful. I think the Acusona stuff was on sale again recently during the Black Friday sales, but I have no idea if it's still available. And again, I didn't pick up the Acusonus bundle for Beatformer. I expected not to get any use out of this, and I've used it in pretty much everything I've worked on for the past half a year. So yeah, but I got it at a bit of a steal. So yeah, so I'm just going to get rid of that gate expander. Yeah, there's nothing stopping you from using that to get the same kind of sort of gate expander effect. So yeah, so this is kind of one of the sort of more mellow. This is kind of where the album's really winding down. So again, I sort of started with, I believe I started with this sample, which is this piano-y pad. So if I go into here and here, it's this sample here. And that ended up sounding like this. So again, nothing hugely sort of revolutionary. I just essentially stretched it out, transposed it down, and threw some effects on it, and that was kind of a nice sort of bed to start with for the rest of the track. And then from there I added this nice VK2 growly bass that sort of filters in as the track opens up a bit. Has this sort of slightly mournful quality to it. So yeah, the drums here are entirely step sequenced and redrum. I sort of sometimes feel like step sequencing using the step sequencer and redrum, for instance, it just kind of lends itself to programming drums differently than if you were to just do them in the sequencer, which I find quite interesting. There's no beat map here, which is unusual. It's just all there. So I've added some organic percussion there and some hats. So again, here's another virus section. So nothing that really sticks out in the mix. It's more just kind of there as an additional kind of seasoning, really, which is really nice. So this is a rare instance where I've used VK2, but I've actually used a patch by someone else. And in this instance, I've used the patch Little Noise by, I believe that's by Tom Pritchard. So yeah, there's no nasal rises, unfortunately, throughout this entire album, which I'm actually, in retrospect, kind of surprised by. So I've got that, and we have, so everything together, we've got the percussion, we've got this whining synth, which is, I think that's another bounced virus thing. So this was kind of this simple sort of virus-based sort of atmospheric sound, and that's kind of what ends the album. Really, I just basically let the track fade out to that sort of high sound. And this is a pad that's just gone through an instance of alligator because I had to get an alligator in there somewhere. Has a very distinctive sound. And an instance of DC2, which I don't use that often, but I've used it a bit here and it sounds quite nice. Just kind of helps to sort of widen things out a bit. Give it a bit more of a warbly sound. So yeah, again, this track makes use of some vocals towards the tail end of the track. So in this instance, it's sort of more falsetto vocals, but performance shifted up. Thorinside asks, so you have strategies for choosing things that might sound good together? So that's actually a really interesting question, and I think that's best kind of... That's actually a really good... Yeah, I'm actually going to dive into that a bit. So I'm going to open up the first track that I put together for this album, because this was essentially kind of the proof of concept that got things going, really. And this track is called Silhouette. So a lot of the stuff that I did in the first track is stuff that I ended up doing throughout the entire album. So if I started with a single block, and I started with a sample, and then just kind of layered some stuff on top of that, added some drums. So I essentially kind of established this palette of sounds, which I sort of mentioned earlier, which was I'll use a redrum at some point, and that redrum will probably use Drumvolution drum hits because I know they sit really well. The kind of kick drums I would go for would always be the more sort of rounded kicks, because you're listening. It's supposed to be kind of like a smooth sort of ambient techno-y kind of thing. You don't want kicks that like hit you over the head. You want sort of nice subby rounded kicks. So just playing the drums here as an example. So it's just the kick there. I think I might have actually baked some extra drum. Oh, here we go. Interesting. So I haven't actually got those there. I could have swore I had some extra drums in this track, but never mind. Muted from track. Oh well. Oh yeah, that's right. So if I can... Yeah, there we go. I just didn't see the beat map channels. Here we go. So it's just a nice round kick. It's just... So that was sort of one of the most important pieces of the palette, really, is a nice round kick. I used Massive for the chord stabs consistently throughout the entire album. I used VK2 and Respire for extra synth elements, and I used my Access Virus for ARPs. So there's a lot of consistency throughout the album, which I think if I'd been working on this over a longer period of time, I would have been like, hang on a second, I need to vary things up, otherwise people are going to get sick of this while they're listening to the album. But actually, I think working in that way kind of helped to give me a bit of extra focus and helped everything sit a bit better together. So again, it was one of those instances where, because I was working on things so quickly, I wasn't able to overthink things, essentially. And I think that approach of relying on a sort of typical palette of sounds throughout an entire project, that can work really, really nicely. I mean, there's certain tracks where I decide to sprinkle in extra elements, and kind of the samples come from all over the place as well. So there's a bit of variation there, but kind of relying on the same sort of palette of sounds throughout the entire thing meant that I'd get to a certain point and be like, okay, so this is where I bring in this particular instrument, and this is where I bring in this particular instrument. So it was a very kind of natural it was, everything had kind of a very natural order as it was kind of being put together, which was a really nice way of working. So whereas if I'm working on other stuff, it kind of negates the burden of choice, which is really interesting because it kind of plays into what I was actually going for in the first place, which is a sort of late 90s, early noughties sort of ambient dub techno kind of feel. Ambient dub techno and breaks kind of feel, because although it wasn't the same as sort of a decade earlier where there were far more limitations in terms of what you could use, there were still more limitations then than there were now. So I feel like the number of tracks I was using and the palette I had access to, it kind of makes sense when sort of looking at it in the context of what I was actually going for. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things where I sort of feel like it was a bit of a happy accident in retrospect, where it just came together that way and that sort of fed into the vibe that I was going for. So one thing I actually wanted to touch on, as well as that, actually I'm just going to have a look at this a bit more. So if you haven't actually listened to the album, this is kind of the block of the first track from the album, which is called Silhouette. And again, this was kind of the blueprint for the rest of the album. Once this track was done, I was like, well, that was loads of fun, let's do that again. And then that happened 11 more times. So yeah, this is Silhouette. So yeah, that's the kind of essence of the first track, really. And so again, lots of things are established here. We've got the massive chord stabs. We've got the VK2 bass. I really liked how that turned out. We've got the virus ARP. We've got sort of atmospheric samples. And it was just really nice to just kind of bring that all together. Busker Bill says, tell me more about the Vox. There's not really a lot to say about it. That was literally just from a sample bank. I just thought it sounded cool to have someone sort of whispering in the background, so I just dropped that in. I honestly don't really know where that came from, so I can't really help you out there. It's not really a lot of processing on there. It's a bit of de-essing, some reverb, touch of Eve MP5. So again, that's kind of a standard thing for me to be using the Eve MP5 to roll off the lows to help things sound a bit smoother. So yeah, I wish there was something really deep and meaningful I could tell you about the vocals, but it was literally a case of I thought this sounded neat. So again, I feel like I need to sort of emphasize when I was actually putting this together, it was a totally self-indulgent project. I had absolutely zero intention of releasing this when I was putting it together. It was only once everything was done, I basically wrote 12 tracks, and even at that point, I wasn't sick of working on this project. I just thought, this is a natural place to let things close. I've really liked I really liked the last track, the track that rounds off the album, which is Lucidity. And I thought that's a really great place to end it. It just had this sort of natural final track feel to it. So that was pretty much it. So yeah, so I thought before I get sick of working on these tracks, I'm just gonna finish it. I'm just gonna wrap things up. I'm not gonna write any more stuff for this particular album. And it was really fun to work on. And because I had zero expectations in terms of an audience, I wasn't holding myself to any particular standard. I just wanted to write something that I wanted to listen to, basically, and enjoy the process of writing. And it was only after I'd put it all together and I came back to it like a week later, I was like, I actually really like the vibe I've sort of got going here. So I sent it to a couple of people who said, this is really good, you should release it. So it was great. Yeah, I really thoroughly enjoyed working on this, like a ridiculous amount. And the fact that I finished it before I got sick of working on everything was just that never happens. Like yeah, it's such a rarity now. It's something I'm trying to work on myself. Actually, if I start getting sick of something, I tend to kind of put it to one side and move on to something else. There's always the danger if I do that I'll just forget about it and never come back to it. So working on this in such a short space of time and having all these kind of this kind of sort of workflow tool set and sort of standard ways of tackling everything was just, it was great. I've really liked it. And if you ever wondered about doing something similar yourself, I highly recommend just writing for the sake of it. I've described it already as being a bit of an autotelic process where the process is its own reward. It's just in the case of writing music and here, you happen to end up with the nice extra end result of of um of a tune which you can do stuff with. So yeah, it was really nice, and I enjoyed the process. I enjoyed the final result, and it was really good. So something else. Oh, Buskin Bills has said, did you deal with the Spotify release? I did actually. Yeah, that was all done through CD Baby. So CD Baby handled all the sort of streaming platforms that weren't Bandcamp. Tony Burns says, milk it like Milk Oldfield, Mike Oldfield, Nocturnal Transmission 2, Nocturnal Transmission 2022. Don't tempt me. I mean, it's a vibe I might revisit, maybe in a different way, using a different palette of sounds, but I really like the approach that I had going here. And it's nice because I'm working on so many, I'm working on projects with other people and working on production music and all that kind of stuff. It's nice to just have an outlet where you can just do whatever you want. And for like, I was genuinely amazed at the response this got when it came out, because lots of people said, "Oh, it's like I get the kind of vibe you're going for. It reminds me." Someone said it reminded them of like early noughties Global Underground discs, and I thought that was great. Like that's it. That's the feel I was going for. I thought that was so cool. Maybe not specifically Global Underground, but kind of like sort of late 90s, early noughties mix compilations, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's really great. Mitch Mood said, how was CD Baby? I've used DistroKid. I've never had any problems with CD Baby. I like the pay once and you're done sort of aspect of it. I've used them for tons of releases at this point. I released my first album, Distant Activity, with them, and I've just stuck with it. Tony Burns says, I went with CD Baby and be afraid to move in case I end up with 2 Spotify artist profiles. I think you can link your profile with whatever you use. I have been tempted to use DistroKid for releasing occasional singles and stuff. But I just never have. I've never felt the need. So I've always just used CD Baby and just paid however much it is to release an album. That's it. From there. So yeah, I've always been happy with them and kind of their sort of back end stuff. Yeah, it's great. So yeah, one thing that was really interesting about working on these tracks is that even though, like I've mentioned, there's so many similarities between kind of the techniques I used here and my other live stream tracks. There's lots of similar techniques, but I think the difference here is that I had a much more sort of focused approach. All of the tracks, they deal with, well, they sort of revolve around a very similar theme, which is kind of sort of nighttime. But essentially, it's kind of just the feeling of sort of nighttime, and just I had this sort of rough idea in my mind of this sort of overarching like arc where it's like it's sort of like about kind of a night out and the morning after kind of thing. Which has been done to death, I know. John Hopkins did it, and yeah, but it sounds completely different. I just thought this is like this. It's the kind of album I'd want to put on, after coming in and just sort of putting my feet up and just chilling out. And yeah, that's the kind of album I wanted to put together. And yeah, I think I kind of hit the vibe I was going for on the head, which was really gratifying. So I'm gonna stop sort of bigging myself up, but it was really cool to sort of just deal with one single mood throughout this entire project that was written over a short period of time, and just focus on that for a bit instead of kind of it was kind of like focusing on one extended track for a few weeks, really, in that regard. Just kind of dealing with sort of a similar mood and just kind of letting that sort of naturally play out, really. And it was really cool. So there's kind of sort of the light moments of the album. There's sort of the more sort of darker moments, like with Test Flight and Canyons, and I think Hindsight has a sort of there's something very wonky about that track, So yeah, it was really, really cool. Mitch Mood says, I'd just love to get playlisted. Yeah, this is actually the first album I submitted one of the tracks to a Spotify playlist. I always forget to do that. So I actually submitted Test Flight, rather. I keep calling it Test Pilot for some reason. I submitted Test Flight to a Spotify playlist and ended up on a Breaks playlist called Zero Gravity, which was really nice. So yeah, that was really satisfying. Yeah. Mitch Mood says your music is awesome to code to. Thank you. That's awesome to know. Tony Byrne says, I think The Onion had an article recently about Spotify reaching its $100 in total payouts to artists. Yeah, it's not great. I feel like I'd be screwed at this point if I was relying entirely on album sales to make a living. I'd be living on the streets like years ago by this point. So yeah, but it's a nice outlet to have. So one thing I thought would be kind of fun to touch upon, which is something that was mentioned earlier in the stream actually, was what I used to master the album. So I've already mentioned that I ran most of the tracks through my analog heat, which is my outboard sort of distortion saturation box, basically, just to give it a bit of saturation and to kind of bump the lows and the highs a bit. It sounded really satisfying after I put everything through there. Like, it's really interesting going back to the tracks now because they sound a lot kind of, I don't know, they sound muddier than I remember when I was working on them. And I think the analog heat kind of did a lot to negate that. So I took all of those. I took the continuous mix, I took all of the individual tracks, and I brought them into Studio One. So this is my mastering session for the entirety of Nocturnal Transmission. I think this might be the first time I've showed a properly finished master in Studio One. So there's really not a lot going on here. This is incredibly straightforward. So Tony Burns says, yes, has Adam upgraded to Studio One 5 yet? Stay tuned. Nope. I'm still on Studio One 2, I think, which is, I feel like that's the most awkwardly numbered of all of the Studio One versions. Studio One 2. No, I'm still using Studio One 2, which has a really weird bug, I think, where when you're rendering audio, you can't use your taskbar in Windows, which is kind of funny. But I've just stuck with it. So when I upgrade, it's going to be a hell of an upgrade. So these are all of the analog heat renders that came out straight out of Reason. I didn't tweak them at all before they were brought into here. It's literally straight out of Reason into Studio One. So so let's talk about what's going on here. It's a really, really simple mastering setup. Everything is going through a bit of EQ. It's going through an ozone imager just to give it a bit of extra stereo width. It's going through an instance of haiku, which I'll talk about in a second. And then that goes through elevate, which is my final limiter. So let's talk about that, shall we? So I think a lot of the work was already done using the analog heat and having consistent levels throughout the entire album. So actually, I'm just going to play a little bit of this first. I might dial elevate back a bit so it's not quite as loud. So that's 5.5 dB. If I just bring that down 5 dB. So yeah, so this is how it sounded. So yeah, most of the work was done by the time it got into Studio One, which is exactly how I like to work when I'm mastering stuff, especially if it's my own stuff, because I have full control over the mixes. It makes more sense to get everything ready before it comes into Studio One, because then you're sort of, if you're trying to fix anything that's wrong with the mix, then just do it in the mix. It's simple. So yeah, I used the same settings on pretty much all of the tracks. So there's a bit of EQ going on, so I've rolled off the rolls, rolled off the lows, just because originally I think it was a bit too boomy. There is an alternative master of this album, which is called the audiophile master, which you can get if you're a Bandcamp subscriber or a Patreon patron. And that's basically where I've dialed the EQ in a bit less, so there's a bit more of that low-end boom and presence. And the limiting is much, much, much less harsh. I haven't gone crazy with the limiting here. I'd say all things considered, this is a reasonably tasteful master. So yeah, there's a bit of a bump in the highs, kind of around sort of 12k-ish. But it's nothing major. The most major thing is kind of in the lows, where I have actually made quite a big cut, because it was quite it needed attenuating, really. It allowed me to kind of open up the sort of master a bit more, without squashing everything. Yes, it's a graphic EQ. I really, really like Equivocate, and I love everything by Newfangled Audio. I don't use Equivocate as much now at the mastering stage as I used to. But I used it here just because it was very easy to kind of dial in the changes I wanted. So it's nothing huge or drastic going on here. In fact, if I just play a chunk of this and disable it, you'll be able to hear for yourself what it's doing. So it just kind of helps to give the mix a bit less boominess, and kind of brings out the highs a bit more, just to kind of give it a bit more air. So yeah, so I also use an instance of Ozone Imager, not massively, just to add a little bit of stereo width. There was already plenty in the original track, so I just added it there just to give it a bit wider sound. And yeah, I did make sure the entire mix was mono compatible as well. That is something that I sometimes overlook. But again, because I did check it was mono compatible after I decided I was going to release it. Originally, when I was working on it, it was basically, I listened to it using my monitors, and I thought it sounded okay, so I left it. Which, this is very much an album that I wrote to be listened to on a system with a decent low-end response, because honestly, I don't really care if it sounds like crap on your phone speakers. It wasn't written for your phone speakers. Don't listen to it on your phone. If you're going to listen to it on your phone, use decent earphones or something, like decent headphones, decent earphones, or listen to it on speakers with a decent low-end response. I don't care about your terrible phone speakers. If you're listening to us on a terrible phone speakers, then you're dead to me, frankly. So I had a bit of extra. Anyway, my minor rant aside. There's a couple. I think there's one instance in the entire album actually where the bass note does go a bit below what I would consider to be comfortable. I can't remember what the track is, but in retrospect, I feel like maybe I should have added like an extra bass layer, like an octave up. But even so, like I think it's kind of part of the charm of the album, is the fact that I wrote it like that and it sounded good to me, so I just kind of left it. It's very easy to overthink these things. I did reference it on a few different systems. I listened to it. It sounded great in my car. So listen to it on a phone, and I will come around and kick you in the gut for each bass drum hit. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's pretty much my approach. If you listen to this on your phone speakers, it's not for you. Actually, no, keep listening. I need those pennies from Spotify. So it goes through this imager, then it goes into Haiku, which is this weird little thing here. So Haiku is basically, as far as I'm aware, it's like a light compressor. I used a very light touch, just dialed it at 14%. I think there's possibly some EQing going on in there. Whatever it does, it sounds good, and I like to dial in like just a smidge sometimes at the mastering stage. So if I really ramp it up, you'll be able to hear what it does, basically. So yeah, you turn it off way too much, it has this really kind of harsh, brittle sound, and it just sounds a bit weird. But you dial it in just a little bit, and it kind of helps the mix to pop just a little bit more. And I quite like that. So yeah, I have kind of a soft spot for some of SoundSpot stuff. I recently picked up another plugin called Focus. They're sort of very simple, but they tend to sound decent if you use a light touch. Obviously, like when I was dialing in massively here, that sounded awful, so I didn't go too crazy with it there. Then that goes through an instance of Elevate, which is my go-to limiter for everything. So I will say that Newfangled Audio's user interfaces, you either love them or you hate them. And I've come around to them. I'm quite used to them. I think they have this sort of weird charm. And especially in their synth plugin Generate, which is absolutely fantastic. I've been using that all over the place recently. It's so refreshing to use a synth that does something new. And Generate definitely does that, and it's wonderful for creating sort of weird textures and harsh leads, and it's great. It's been super useful for working on more aggressive stuff, or even more sort of like the textural stuff is really interesting. Definitely try out Pendulate, which is like a free version of Generate if you get the chance. So Elevate, it just applies a 5.5 dB gain. I'm not sure why I went with 5.5. It just sounded right to me. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There is a transient emphasis section here, which basically detects transients in the incoming signal and then passes some of that through to the clipper section. So you end up with kind of more pops in your transients. In fact, I'll demonstrate that during... That might actually be a good track to try it with. So I do sometimes use that on my tracks. It is a useful feature, but I try not to use it on the master because sometimes it can kind of pick up things that aren't actually transients. It doesn't happen very often. Well, it can pick up things that I don't want it to actually pick up. They probably are transients. But it can be useful. I haven't used it on this album because it's not the kind of album where I want the transients to really pop out as much. I just wanted, like, it's quite a smooth listen, so I wanted to keep it that way. So yeah, this isn't doing a huge amount. It's just applying 5.5 dB of gain. And that's it really. I believe it's set to dither at 16-bit because the release format was 16-bit. And that's pretty much it. There's one other thing I wanted to touch on as well. But yeah, consistency is what made mastering this incredibly easy. I think if this had been another album project where I had tracks that didn't have such a consistent sound to them, then I would have gone way more into kind of sort of helping everything to sit together better and kind of working on a more consistent sound. But because that was already there, it was incredibly easy to do. In this instance, I didn't want to overcook it at the mastering stage. I think it would have ruined the sound of it. Octave Cat has asked, Adam, do you have any DMG audio plugins? I do not. I'm not even sure if I've heard of DMG audio. No, I don't. So yeah, there's actually one track where I added a really weird EQ, and that is this track Hindsight, which I mentioned earlier actually. So this actually has a really massive EQ scoop on it, which I generally wouldn't do. Like, that is massive. So that is at about 14.5K. I've just completely scooped that out, which might seem really, really odd. So the reason I did that is I'll turn it off and while it's playing, and you'll be able to hear for yourself. There's a particular element in that track that sounded absolutely fine when I was actually working on the track itself. And it was only after I ran it through the analog heat and I brought it into Studio One and processed it a bit that it had this really nasty harshness to it. It's interesting listening to it now because I can't hear it as obviously on my headphones. But when I was listening to it on monitors, it just had this really brittle kind of harshness to it, and it just completely took me out of listening to the album itself. So at this point, I'd kind of bounced everything, and I was like, well, I could go in and rebounce everything through analog heat, and I'd have to rebounce the continuous mix through analog heat. And it's an hour of my life that I just have to lose. And I think it was like I think there's like this I think it's a virus ARP that's going on in there actually, and I think there's something going on with the analog heat or at the mastering stage where it just made it sound way too harsh. So again, I'll just kind of turn it on and off so you can hear for yourself. So it comes in later in the track actually, I think. I think it's actually like a background percussive layer or something. So yeah, it just had this really horrible digital harshness to it, and I was like, this does not sit with the rest of the album. So I could rebounce everything, or I could try using a massive, massive EQ scoop. So that's exactly what I did. I use a really, really narrow EQ scoop. There's not really anything else going on around there. So that's exactly what I did, which seems kind of, in retrospect, it seems kind of lazy. But again, I didn't really intend for anyone to listen to this. And I certainly didn't expect to be showing this to people during a stream when I actually did it. At the time, I was like, that sounds all right. I'll just go with that. So I actually had to rebounce the continuous mix with that EQ automated so that I could bring it into the project view in Studio One and not have to mess around. OctaveCat says, or use Oak Sound Soothe. I've heard of Soothe. I've heard that's really good. The problem is I don't think I have that much of a use for it. It's certainly not for the price, but it does look really good. And I do have a soft spot for, again, it's one of those things that does something really, really well, has a very particular use. And I bet it'd be quite useful for sort of out of the box thinking as well. So yeah, that's pretty much the entire mastering setup right there. It's really simple, really, really simple stuff. Bit of EQ, bit of stereo widening, bit of this haiku gubbins, and then through to the limiter. And that's it really. So yeah, just to kind of go over some other stuff, like I can't, like I've said it so many times now, you're probably sick of me saying it. Didn't intend to release this. It was supposed to be something that I was going to listen to myself and maybe share with like a few friends who would enjoy it. Maybe, you know, once lockdown is ended or you know, we can actually meet up with people again, I thought it'd be nice to chill out to and listen to in the background kind of thing. So it's so super self-indulgent. But some of my favorite albums are incredibly self-indulgent, and you know, it was just nice after finishing the album to send it to a couple of people and just have them be like, this is really cool. So yeah, that was really rewarding, and I essentially kind of punted it out the door when I wrote. So it got to a point where I'll talk a bit about how it was released actually, because I think that's quite interesting in and of itself. So yeah, had no intention of releasing it, blah blah. Got to a point where where I was thinking, okay, I am actually going to release this. So, and then I started thinking, when am I going to release it? When am I going to start talking about it? What's going on? And then I realized I have a Patreon and I have Bandcamp subscribers, people who are actively supporting me financially for creating this kind of stuff. Wouldn't it be cool to just release it to those people first and then worry about getting it to other people? So OctaveCat has asked Adam how long after exporting from Studio One before it shows up on Spotify. I'm actually going to get to that in a sec. So I shared it with folks on Patreon and Bandcamp like immediately as soon as I finished it. Like a week later, I was like, here it is. Before I get cold feet and decide to change my mind, I sort of put together some like a little bit of artwork, which you can see if you go to my Bandcamp page or Spotify or whatever, which was quite interesting. I sent it to one friend who said, I was worried about the artwork being too dark. It's basically a dark sort of sky with a transmission mast. I tried a few ideas and none of them really worked. And then I sort of just thought about it and thought, what's the first thing I think of when I think of the name Nocturnal Transmission? And I thought a transmission mast at night. So that's what I went with. So it's a really, really dark album cover. And I sent it to one friend who said, I'm slightly worried it's too dark. And he said, nah, it looks fine on my display. Don't worry about it. I sent it to another colleague and friend of mine. And he said, I thought for a second you were going with a sort of Spinal Tap, none more black kind of approach, before I realized there was actually a picture there. So it's a very dark album cover. Tony Burns says, actually I meant to say I love the album cover, your own photo. It's not my own photo. So what I tend to do with my album covers now is I tend to use places like Unsplash, which have kind of loads of really nice pictures you can use, and then I'll essentially it's kind of similar to what I was doing with the samples throughout this album, really kind of taking something and making it, sort of tweaking it to look completely different, kind of mixing bits together, which I thought was kind of appropriate for this release in particular. So I really liked how that came together. It looks nothing like the original picture that I used, or the original pictures that I used. I think I used another layer, which was a photo that I took around here. But it's really neat because if you look out of the window from where I am now, there is like a big transmission tower on the horizon at Emily Moore. And it's yeah, it looks very much like the one in the album cover. So it's nice to kind of look out at night and be like, that looks exactly like the album cover. So anyway, yes, the release. It was released directly to Patreon and Bandcamp subscribers, and folks there were like, yeah, this is cool, thanks. And then I sort of thought, okay, I don't want to get cold feet. I just want to release it. So I set a date for the end of November. Like, it was about 3 weeks after giving it to people on Bandcamp and Patreon, and I was like, I'm going to release it on this date. And that was far enough in the future where all of the distribution platforms would have it and be able to release it on the same day. If you try and release everything immediately using CD Baby, everything will release, your album will basically come out sporadically across the different distribution services. You won't be able to set a release date, which is kind of poor. So you don't really want that. I actually did that with my first album, and it wasn't a great idea. Lesson learned. Set a release date and stick to it. So I set it for the end of November, and I was like, cool, I'm just going to pull the trigger and go for it, and then worry about how I'm going to talk about it afterwards. So that's what I did. I didn't do any sort of major promotion or anything. I was just like, here's a couple of tracks from the album, check it out, and it's coming out at the end of the month, kind of thing. So that was really, really, really satisfying to do, because normally when I release an album, I'll talk about it and sort of release individual tracks, and the process can go on for ages, and it's not something I really enjoy doing. Like, I'm just not big into the whole self-promotion thing. So it was just really nice to say the album's coming out in a few weeks, and check it out if you want, I guess. I didn't expect that many people to listen to it, really. So that's why I was so surprised when it did come out, and people were like, I really like this, and it had a really nice reception when it came out. It really clicked with the people who kind of like got it, really. And I think the Spotify playlist submission stuff helped a bit there as well. And it was just really satisfying to be like, hey, that's cool. I've released this, and people like it, and it's kind of organically doing its thing. In many regards, I think it's had more attention than other albums, which I've put a lot more effort into promoting, which I find fascinating. So it's also interesting, kind of thinking about the idea of overthinking releases. I think I've definitely done that with my live stream session stuff. So it's got to the point now where I just need to sort out some kind of album cover and release it, because I've just let it drag for way too long. But I suspect that's something I'll be doing in the new year. At this point, there'll probably be 2 albums ready to go before I actually release the first, but there we go. So yeah, it's weird to think that the whole thing came sort of from inception to release happened over a period of about 2 months, really. So I started working on this at the start of October, and it was out the door and on streaming platforms at the end of November rather. I've never worked on something. It's definitely one of the more spontaneous musical projects I've worked on, and releasing it was one of the more spontaneous decisions I've ever made musically. And I am super happy that I did. There's something to be said for that approach of just getting it out there and letting people make their own minds up. There's no point. Well, you're not doing any favors by releasing an album. Well, putting an album's worth of material together and then just sitting on it endlessly because you want it to be better. I've made that mistake before, and it just ends up sounding overcooked. And by the time it comes out, you're sick of it, and it's a sad place to be, really. So yeah, my advice is to get to a place where you're happy and release your stuff. Don't sit on it for ages. Yeah, cool. So that's pretty much it for Nocturnal Transmission, really. We've gone from sort of inception to workflow to the continuous mix and sort of all the techniques I used while I was actually working on it, to the mastering stage, to the release. I don't really think there's anything else I can cover. This has been quite a comprehensive sort of dive into. Cool, that is bright when you've just been looking at Studio One. Oh. Octave Cat says, best place to buy the WAV or FLAC versions. You can get the entire album in the format of your choice from Bandcamp. So it's adamfielding.bandcamp.com. It's pay what you want. So if you want to download it for free, go for it. Fill your boots. Have fun. If you really like it and you want to throw a couple of pennies my way, then it's always very much appreciated. But you don't have to. There's no obligation. Just enjoy it. And that includes, it says the full album, there's individual tracks and the continuous mix. Personally, I would have liked to have just released the album, if I'd released it on a physical format, like I probably would have just released the continuous mix and maybe split it into individual tracks. But with things the way they are, I know people want to listen to individual tracks and don't necessarily just want to listen to one continuous mix all the time. So I did break it into individual tracks. But the continuous mix is 100% absolutely the best way to listen to it, in my opinion. That's how it's intended to be heard. So yeah, I've listened. Yeah, it's very much that's how it should be heard. Not on phone speakers. Don't listen to it on phone speakers. I won't like that. I won't like it. So yeah, there's not really anything else I can cover. So yes, I'm probably gonna leave it there for this stream. But thanks so much for joining me and for asking all those lovely questions throughout. And Basket Bills has asked, how much would you earn from one person playing the whole album on Spotify? Not a lot is the answer to that. I honestly don't know the exact figure, but it's really not a lot. But you know, that's not to say don't listen to it on Spotify, because you know those I could really do with that extra 7p. So, but yeah, it's not a lot. Spotify's pretty poor in that regard. YouTube is also really poor in that regard in terms of artist payouts. How much did it cost to publish the album? I think it was something like $40, something like that. So not a massive amount. I think I had to get a barcode for it as well, a UPC. So but that's the case with everything. Annoyingly, I missed a Black Friday distribution deal by about a week, so that figures. But you know, that's life. I think it's a small price to pay to get my music out there. So yeah. Anyway, cool. Right, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna wrap this up. So if you're watching this on YouTube, thanks so much for checking out this stream. And if you haven't listened to Nocturnal Transmission yet, go and listen to it. It's everywhere. But if you really like it, grab it from Bandcamp. That's adamfielding.bandcamp.com. You can get it in the format of your choice. And if you really like it, throw some pennies at me and I will greatly appreciate that. Or if you really, really, really like it and you want a whole bunch of extra stuff, you can become a Patreon supporter. And there is a ridiculous amount of extra content that you can get for doing that. Like, it's absurd. But I'm not big into the self-promotion thing, honest. So awesome. Cool. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see some of you next time. And until then, cheers and bye-bye.